So let's continue with our panel and with our international panel. And now it's the turn of Eduardo Benitez-Inglott Ballesteros. Eduardo, I suppose you're going to speak in English, isn't it? Okay. Thank you. Well, even if, as everybody here can understand, Eduardo also is Spanish. He's come from Canary Island. Actually, he spent all this period of studies in United Kingdom, and starting with a Bachelor of Art in University of London, King's College, and then continuing with a Master in Medieval Studies in St. Catherine's College of the University of Oxford. And now, Eduardo, in this moment, he is, well, since 2019, is a PhD student of the Wolfson College, also in University of Oxford. And maybe, well, Eduardo and I, we don't know each other, but we share some interests, like this totally insane idea to compare England and Castile and Leon, no, in Middle Ages. And in fact, his research is about Inquisition in late medieval England and Castile Leon, socio-political uncertainty, human doubt, and the coming of heresy. All these supervised by Dr. John Edwards. And today, Eduardo is going to speak about, well, something that really deals with his own research. No, the title of his paper is Discordia in Regno e Rese Subique: Disobedience, Social Political Tensions, and the Creation of Heresy. Please, Eduardo, when you want.
Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen.
Okay.
Okay. Right, can you see? Can you see the screen now?
Wait a moment.
Yes, we can.
We can see.
Okay. The first thing I want to say, of course, is to give thanks to the organizers for choosing my paper. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you to discuss some results of my doctoral research. So we go on. Okay. Is heresy synonymous with dissent, or is it just a loose and expedient category devised by authorities? I want to explore these issues through a comparative examination of two laws: the English anti-heresy statute, de heretico comburendo, of March 1401, and the Castilian Sentencia Estatuto and Purity of Blood Sentencia Estatuto of June 1449. I seek to propose that both laws were attempts at addressing the breakdown of public order and the disruption of political life by endowing heresy with a political dimension. The heretico and the sentencia exploit the social ambiguity surrounding its intended victims, Lollards and Judeo-conversos, to denounce the surreptitious political agency as the heretical fifth column seeking to destroy church and kingdom. 1401 and 1449 represent the final step of a dual process of firstly hereticating and then scapegoating via generalization and shift. Yet heresy and efforts to suppress it were not created ex nihilo. Before examining the processes that led to the making and scapegoating of heretics in the period concerned, it is paramount to understand how rivalries between distinct political factions aiming at controlling political power and the manner of its administration influenced English and Castilian governmental attitudes towards Wycliffites and Jews, the forerunners of Lollards and Judeo-conversos. On the screen, you can see two diagrams outlining the power struggles which plagued England and Castile in the period concerned. The popular commons and later on some parliamentary quarters reacted negatively against Richard II of England's favoritism and tyranny throughout the 1380s and 90s, because they felt increasingly excluded both from court and from political influence. Similarly, the monopolization of power by Don Álvaro de Luna, Juan II of Castile's favorite, in the process of the poderío real absoluto, or absolute royal powers enhancement, also alienated their nobility and urban governments. Factions spiraled into a negative quid pro quo, a war of words and deeds. As soon as the aristocratic factions detected their influence was being nullified via their royal council. The anger of urban authorities completed a triangle because they felt that the social contract endowing the kingdom's towns with political prominence in decision-making was being violated. The conflict, popular commons versus crown of the peasants' revolt of 1381, led to the eventual denunciation of the followers of the Oxford theologian John Wycliffe as heretics in 1382. The first instance of a general rebellion against an English monarch's government, in 1381, the popular commons resented the government's taxation and legal administration. In November 1381, the crown consequently saw in, I quote, the rumor and insurrection of villains and other malefactors, the origin of upheaval. Yet, 6 months later, a petition was seeking to give authority of royal commissions to sheriffs and other officials, upon certification of a bishop in chancery, to arrest and imprison, I quote, many wicked persons within the said kingdom, journeying from country to country, to the great embellishment of the faith and destruction of the laws and the estate of the Holy Church, and the great peril of the souls of the people of the whole realm. They were said to, I quote, preach various slanderous matters to sow discord and dissension between the various estates of the said kingdom, both temporal as well as spiritual, to the perturbation of the people and the great peril of all the kingdom. In May 1382, English legislative efforts refocused from civil rebels into a comparatively smaller group linked with John Wycliffe and the University of Oxford. The very same day of the condemnation of some of Wycliffe's doctrines and errors at London's Blackfriars Priory on the 21st of May, Bishop William Wickham of Winchester sends a mandate to the parish of Odingham, and you can see that as source number 4 in the handout you should have received. He orders the vicar to inhibit some of Wycliffe's Oxonian colleagues from preaching his condemned doctrines. 5 days later, the parliamentary petitions we've just explored becomes a statute with the full force of the law. But it is the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Kearney, who issues a general mandate to safeguard the kingdom's tranquility on the 30th of May. He enjoins all prelates to, I quote, be watchful for those who dressed in sheep's clothing but wolves within deceitfully wander about to seize and disperse the sheep by preaching Wycliffe's academic and by then condemned heresies and errors. With hindsight, we can grasp the chain reaction. Kearney builds upon Parliament's statute and throws the Wycliffite academic minority into the national limelight. The ecclesiastical power helps the state rework its response to social conflict by concentrating on the academic leaders of what could become an extremely dangerous heterodox movement menacing the entire kingdom. By May in 1382, Wycliffite were England's heresy, threatening to metastasize and destroy the established order. Similarly, factionalism and another revolt, this time anti-Semitic, led to the initial heretication of Castilian Jews. Juan I's passing in 1390 led to a widespread breakdown in law and order due to the disagreements over the type of regency to be established over Enrique III between the Trastámara Epigons, also known as Epigonos Trastámaras, related by blood to the Trastámara dynasty, which had been ruling since 1369, and the new self-made nobleza de servicio, or nobility of service. The resulting institutional weakness made possible an unparalleled pouring of anti-Semitism. In June 1391, Écijar's Archdeacon Ferran Martínez initiated in Seville the greatest catastrophe that was to befall late medieval Iberian Jewry. The ghosts of the 1391 anti-Semite massacres haunted the Castilian realm from then onwards, and by 1412, after a protracted process, the crown was implying that Jews were the source of Christian heresy. In 1406, Enrique III dies. His widow, Queen Catherine of Lancaster, and his brother, Infante Fernando de Antequera, an Epigono, become co-regents of Juan II, and on and off seeks to displace each other from the regency. In 1408, Antequera leads a coup to remove Catherine from government and to assume control of the royal council. Eventually, they sign a concord in June, but issue a joint ordinance shortly afterwards, denouncing the many wrongs and grievances caused by Jews' socio-economic role, I quote, from which accrue great disservice to me and to my kind, and to me and a great injury to the inhabitants of my kingdoms. Jews are the very minority the crown sought to protect from urban anti-Semitic attacks until then. In returning to long past levels of royal anti-Semitism, the Castilian crown assumes a public anti-Semitic stance comparable to that which the petitions of the city's representatives had been expressing via Cortes. Due to its allegiance to anti-Pope Benedict XIII, on the 2nd of January 1412, the Castilian crown complements the 1408 precedent and by going further and ordering to, I quote, remove and separate the said Christians from any chance of Jewish heresy, in the so-called first version of the Leyes de Ayllón, for the zone of Castile controlled by Queen Catherine. For his dominions, Infante Fernando issues a second, milder version, also known as the Cifuentes version, of the Leyes on the 17th of July. Though the word herejía, heresy, is not specifically mentioned in its preamble, the main thrust behind Cifuentes is similar to Ayllón. Religious communion between faiths remains the source of religious disorder. Despite emphasizing that Jews are to be protected, they are still to suffer segregation for the sake of the kingdom's stability, on account of their alleged corruption of faithful Christians. To be a more effective political tool, heterodoxy needed to become a grey area in itself, more ill-defined, less obvious, and more surreptitious. While in England it was a case of generalizing heterodoxy beyond university walls, in Castile it was a case of shifting the attention towards who the converses, leaving Jews behind. In the 1380s, the English were facing the worst constitutional crisis to date. The so-called Lords Appellant had succeeded in the wonderful Parliament of 1386 by imposing a commission upon the crown against Richard II's will to displace the king's advisers. Yet, whilst conflict emerged between the newly appointed controlling council and the crown, the Bishop of Worcester issues a long overdue mandate to his diocese on the 10th of August 1387, and this is the earliest official use of the term Lollard. This is a most strange instrument. On the one hand, rather than focusing on tackling unlicensed local preachers in his diocese, as Wickingham's 1382 mandate had done, Wakefield relates the events going on in Worcester to a wider heretical alliance or confederatio. This may be an indirect reference to the simultaneous surveillance of Augustinian friars underway since May 1387. On the other, this is a rare example of almost word-for-word selective repetition of provincial legislation. This time, Kearney's 1382 mandate, which we've just explored. But as the inclusion of an appendix of Wycliffe's errors and heresies in the 1382 injunction, Kearney never acted against Lollardos, let alone against a wider alliance operating under such common denominator. In 1382, Kearney only intended to try and curtail the early spread of the Wycliffite heresy beyond Oxford. By acting against a confederatio Lollardorum, Wakefield blurs the parameters between academic and non-academic heresy, generalizing opprobrium to include those whose connections lie far away from the university. Whilst the vast majority of Wycliffe's controversial works and immediate disciples were surely Lollards, not every Lollard person could be demonstrably a Wycliffite. The Lollard heresy could include eccentrics, apostates, and or misfits who had or hadn't direct or indirect connection with Wycliffism. Later on in the merciless Parliament of 1388, the Lords Appellant managed to charge several of the king's advisers with treason. While this is unwrapping, the crown issues a writ on the 30th of March, with the aim of setting up national commissions to search for Latin and vernacular books that Wycliffe and his associates had supposedly, I quote, written, compiled, communicated, and published, weakening the Orthodox faith to the evident subversion of many persons. On the 13th of October, the Crown directs further letters patent to sheriffs, mayors, bailiffs, ministers, and others to arrest vagabond apostate Augustinian friars throughout the realm. The 1382 anti-Oxford campaign of innuendo and public charges had generalized into a full-scale attempt by a hierarchy to defend the church and the kingdom against a heresy which they saw as filtering into the English system. In the eyes of authorities, Lollard intellectual mobility and wandering apostate friars, also known as Girovaggi, were the main vectors of transmission of the English heresies Lollardorum. Down south, to understand the 1449 Sentencia, it is important to understand that the massive conversions of 1391 and onwards revolutionized perceptions of religious identity and belonging. There were doubts about the Judeo-conversos' loyalty to the Christian faith. Forced conversion was the main factor of religious doubt, since it opened the door to discrepancies between religious adherence and inner belief, breaking the clear-cut medieval system of religious allegiance. Used forced baptisms in the late 14th and 15th centuries led to the appearance of a new social-religious category, the Cristiano Nuevo, Judeo-converso, or also known as New Christians. How to determine whether they were true Christian converts? Judeo-conversos could be easily accused of being covert heretics, undetected Judaizers spreading unorthodoxy within the Christian community. Unlike the case of the clearly identifiable Jew, it would be comparatively more difficult to detect fake converts from the mainstream body of true Christians to which she or he was nominally an internal element. Despite their socio-economic integration took time to achieve, by 1449 Judeo-conversos had important roles in the royal and urban administrations. As time progressed, there arose feelings of suspicion towards their socio-economic integration. All Christians sharing an identity as members of a dominant group would have seen in Judeo-conversos a threat to their socio-economic status, especially since the latter were better equipped and had access to councils, urban oligarchies, and the church by virtue of their Christian baptism. This was another factor encouraging the shift of institutional attention from Jews to Judeo-conversos. By now, we can conclude that the official denunciation of the Wycliffites and Jewish minorities as a source of heresy took place after two revolts, after two periods of disobedience, and shall be demonstrated the generalization of heresy in the form of Lollardy, Wycliffism's alter ego, and the shift of attention towards Judeo-conversos paved the way for the events of 1401 and 1449. The Heretico and the Sentencia are immediate products of the intragovernmental conflicts explored in the beginning. The legitimacy issues which Henry Bolingbroke, later on known as Henry IV, faced as a consequence of deposing Richard II, provided the roots from which the Heretico flourished in 1401. In a similar way, 1449 Sentencia emerged out of a power deadlock between crown, nobility, and cities. As put by the alliterative poem Richard the Relentless, or Richard without counsel, the reason for Henry IV's enthronement had been his predecessor's alienating tyranny. Richard II's covetousness of power, and by extent his inability to reach some degree of constitutional integration, ultimately destroyed his crown. Since the king could only be reformed against his will, the only two paths remaining for his opponents were either to submit to their own destruction or remove and replace him, which they did. After replacing Richard, the Status et Communitatis Regni eventually ratified Henry IV through Parliament as his successor. But usurpation was an illegitimate act which in itself greatly disrupted the kingdom's political well-being. Henry's parliamentary confirmation wouldn't suffice to secure his grip on the throne. To solve this, was there something better for Henry IV than to present himself as a godly ruler under whose command the Lollard pestilence would be purged? The Lollard pestilence, by the way, which his predecessor had been unable to tackle. Lollardy was in fact so fundamental for the security of the new Lancastrian regime that, as Paul Strom has argued, had it not existed, they would have had to devise anything in its stead. The Heretico was informed by the sequence of measures against the Wycliffite heresy, begun in 1382 and continued in the late 1380s against Lollards, which coincided with the breakdown of public order and the disruption of political life. The causa sine qua non for 1401 statute was an individual caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a priest degraded for heresy by Canterbury's convocation in late February 1401. William Sautre. Whilst Parliament was in session, anonymous prelates requested therein for officials to be present and able to do what is incumbent at the sentencing of heretics who, in their opinion, were stirring people to sedition or insurrection. Henry IV's subsequent responsio went well beyond the petition's aims by ordering that relapsed heretics were to be, I quote, publicly burnt in a high place to strike fear into the minds of others. The king went on to witness and read the heretical comburendo of the 26th of February, the same day Sautre's degradation terminated. On the 10th of March, the statute finally came into being for, I quote, the eschewing of such dissensions, divisions, heads, slanders, and perils in time to come. The heretical was a turning point. It created a political causal fiction following strictly political motives. The new Lancastrian regime was attempting to reinforce its legitimacy by redirecting the minds of the whole English community towards a heretical enemy within. This mechanism Paul demands labels a chronological reversal. The Lollard threat, perceived to be the external trigger of the 1401 measure, was in fact the result of a cunning internal machination. Henry's concerted action with Parliament to reinforce his legitimacy. The heretical comurendo does not react and defend, but exaggerates and attacks Lollardist religious political activism. Before concluding, I shall be demonstrated the sentencia is also a political causal fiction. Toledan authorities introduced the sentencia statuto in the midst of a political deadlock derived from the controversies surrounding Don Álvaro de Luna as deputy of the king's increased poderío real absoluto that had taken the kingdom of Castile to breaking point by 1449. In 1425, Alfonso V of Aragon sends a letter to the Señor of Pedraza. The first known instance linking Luna with tyranny, Alfonso denounces that Luna's actions are intended to, I quote, free and tyrannically rule over the king's person and over his kingdoms, not allowing any person he disliked being close to the king. For his brother Juan II of Navarre, Luna is also an oppressor and a tyrant. For both, the privado epitomizes the tyrannical condition at its finest. He has unlawfully appropriated the royal function ex effectu tituli and ex effectu exerciti, with virtually no restrictions to his actions. This echoes in the minds of the Toledan intellectual who designed the sentencia. Marcos García de la Mora, the Sentencia Estatutos ideologue, asserts the constitutional place of the Castilian Comunidad, akin to the English communities regni, as a political structure exempt from royal power and therefore with limited legitimacy to act on, correct, or dissolve the king's poderío. As the first excerpt, which we see in the screen from García de la Mora's Memorial, underlines, royal disobedience could be met with urban resistance. It is in the desire of eliminating Álvaro de Luna that the Castilian nobiliary and urban factions share the same means to reach different constitutional goals. In the eyes of García de la Mora, Luna is not alone. He pursues his tyrannical aims with the help of his pseudo-converso minions. The 1449 reaction was rooted in the fact that in the eyes of the urban authorities, the enhanced socio-economic role of pseudo-conversos under Álvaro de Luna's aegis made them part and parcel of the same political aberration, the poderío real absoluto. As we saw for 1401, the Castilian sentencias causa sine qua non was an individual court in difficult circumstances in January 1449. Alonso de Cota, a judeo-converso who was the main collector of Álvaro de Luna's arrendamiento en masa, or tax gathering en masse, in Toledo. Cota's collection of the arrendamiento sparked a revolt on the 26th of January, and this eventually became the cornerstone of the sentencia in June 1449, when the mayor of the city, Pedro Sarmiento, needed an excuse to justify the city's disobedience to the crown before surrendering control. The sentencia, whilst announcing that Luna has, I quote, leased your income, taxes, and rights to unfaithful and heretical persons por vía de masa, also attacks judeo-conversos on the grounds of economic mismanagement and heresy, accusing them of having ravaged all oldest households and estates of all Christians of this city, and of seeking to, I quote, destroy the Holy Catholic faith and the old Christians who believe in it. In 1449, Toledan rebels hit three targets with one shot. Firstly, attack the poderío via Don Álvaro de Luna. Secondly, remove the judeo-converso group threat. And thirdly, declare them the new political religious scapegoat of Castile. By way of conclusion, the political activism of the Wycliffite Lollard and the Jewish judeo-converso minorities, their political disobedience is no more than a distorted image, a scapegoating bluff sponsored by the English crown in 1401 and by several elements of the Castilian polity in 1449. The accusation of heresy was not used for stigmatizing the political religious opponent, as Alexander Pachowski did put it once, because there simply was no concerted actions, there simply was no concerted religious, political, or opposition to be tackled by 1401 and 1449. Socio-political instability is thus the matrix of heresy's political import through the scheme of heretication, generalization, shift, and finally scapegoating. Both the heretical and the sententia are mere smokescreens to divert the attention away from something we'll no doubt feel eerily familiar with, the utter and absolute failure of reaching political consensus to restore international trust. Grazie.
Giovanni, hai il microfono?
Giovanni, il microfono.
Grazie. Ero già arrivato alla seguente relatrice io. Thank you, Eduardo. I was saying that it was such an inspiring paper, and there would be so much to comment on. But actually, we have a little in hurry, so we will pass directly to the new speaker, and we postpone every discussion, every question for the debate at the end of this panel.